Thursday, not Friday, and you're watching the SPL waiting room. What does Gore usually say? Your one-stop shop for
Hi,
all
guys,
things.
gals, and non-binary pals.
Right.
Right.
Welcome into the SPL waiting room, your one-stop shop for all things SMITE Pro League.
related.
And then he gives a bunch of butts.
But you can also go to SMITEProLeague.com or YouTube.com SMITEVOD or YouTube.com SMITEPro, depending on the type of content you want to watch. Anyway, it's the setup show for what should be another very exciting week in the SPL. That's right. We are starting on Thursday this week. Got a couple matches today, a couple matches tomorrow on Friday, and then, wouldn't you guess it, a couple more triple headers. Now, last weekend in the SPL, we've talked about this, guys, and we'll sink our teeth into it a little bit more moving forward. But last weekend in the SPL was some of the craziest Smite we've seen in a little while with the beads and the Aegis interaction and that situation. Miff, it really brought about some of the most intense and dynamic Smite we've seen in a little bit.
And I'm not sure that it's really a byproduct of the fact that beads Aegis, it has been just such a core mechanic. But of course it has. But I think it's more of an overarching issue around the fact that Smite's meta has largely been standardized for the last couple of years. I like to call it solved meta. We've seen it in a couple of esports or even sports before, where once the top players get a general lock on how we want to play the game, it generally stays that exact same way. So now that Aegis has been removed, it essentially unsolves the meta, which is why we have these emergent new gods or emergent new gameplay mechanics or even strategies, and that's what makes an interesting Smite.
Well, we get to talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. Blues Ultra, of course, every single week breaks down what happened. Good luck this week because, as we've mentioned, a lot of ups and downs across the league last week. Really some surprises. I think the Camelot Kings really struggling last weekend. Maybe my biggest surprise, J-Mac, they have an 0-2 weekend. Losing to the Dragons, that's fair. That's a toss-up set, a 3-game set. They go to 3 and lose against the Valkyries. Remember, that's like a base race type scenario. And so this is probably the least chaotic screen we're going to get on these Blues Ultra graphics. But who are the losers of the weekend last weekend? The Camelot Kings.
Yeah, the Camelot Kings, the Oni Warriors as well, also went 0-2 in their matchups. Again, against some tough opponents. I think it's the Titans and the Bolts that they end up losing to. But, seeing the Kings fall down 0-2, against the Dragons, like you said, not really like expected, but not, right. Kind of a shot against them. The Jade Dragons are a top team for a reason. I mean, they're sitting at that number 2 seed. Losing to the Valkyries definitely is going to hurt a little bit because, like, again, we talk about the Valkyries, it's a team that's been struggling to kind of find their groove, to really be able to kind of bunker down in. But we did see that the Kings are still capable of that dominant playstyle. I mean, game number 2 against the Valks was the fastest game of the weekend at just over 22 minutes. Completely one-sided matchup. I mean, the Kings, Captain Twig was like all over the map, like 10-1, 10-2 by the end of the game on the Naja. So we know the Kings are capable of it. I just can't honestly explain to you what happened aside from Aquarius just kind of diffed in the solo lane for a couple of games and really kept that team alive.
Right, and I figured after that game, too, that was going to be the set, right? The Kings came back into it, and that was it, and ended up not being the case. Thanks again, of course, to Blues Ultra for putting those graphics together. It's at Blues Ultra on Twitter. And every single week, these awesome kind of breakdowns come out. So if you're not able to watch all the games, or you were, and you want to really see them condensed into a really awesome format, Blues Ultra is the place you want to go. And last week as well, if we talk about fantasy teams, things like that, how our squads have been doing, Miff, it would appear that Hindu Man's team had another fantastic week. Remember, for everyone at home that doesn't have our teams memorized, it's just the Leviathans, top to bottom, including coach. Hindu Man's team is just the Atlantis Leviathans. Was Mimi at first. Now apparently is a shoe-in to just win our fantasy league every week.
Should have known, right? Should have known that any Zapman team is going to really gear up going to the end of the year. I allowed Hindu Man to have that squad for the meme.
Wait, was it you? I thought Gore was the one.
Gore gave up one of his pieces, but once Hindu had kind of made it clear that he wanted all the Levi's, I allowed it to happen. Me personally,
there were some picks that you were considering taking.
I was going to, yeah.
But
I figured better for the bits.
Right. My goodness, yeah. And think about the week. Oh God, we have a lot to talk about with last week. I was going to talk about the week that Panatom had. The
a good
Susano specifically was absolutely ridiculous. But I look towards the end of the year. So we have 2 weekends left, counting this weekend, next weekend, then phase 3 is over. I assume that's when our fantasy will be over as well. I don't think we can do anything for playoffs. J-Mac, do you think the Leviathan squad that is Hindu Man's team is just a shoe-in to win every weekend from this point on?
I think they've got a really good shot. I mean, if they keep playing the way that they have, they're very consistent across the board. Every single pick that they go to is very calculated. Even if we do end up going back, once the Beads Aegis interaction does end up getting its fix and proper patch through, this is still a team that was winning even without that interaction going through kind of just before. So I think that the Leviathans are on the rise. I think they can definitely be a team that can win out through the remainder of here. If not number 1 seed, I think Leviathans are at least shoe in for top 2 guaranteed.
Yeah, interesting to see what the Leviathans get done this weekend. Because remember, in the past, it's been a team that's been a bit resistant to meta changes. And so if they're able to kind of figure things out this weekend and before the fix, that'd be a really good look for the Leviathans. But last weekend, one of the major upsets that we had so far this year was the Valhalla Valkyries beating the Camelot Kings in a 2-1 set. Game 1, very competitive. Game 2, as we've mentioned, not competitive at all. And then Game 3,
very competitive.
Very, very competitive
Wild.
once again. And so the Valhalla Valkyries, they finally capitalize. And for the first time, our weekly MVP, our most valuable primer, is from the Valhalla Valkyries. Aquarius, the solo laner for the Valhalla Valkyries, wins our most valuable primer for the week. In Myth, for good reason. In this set against the Kings, I mean, he's playing against Variety, one of the goats of the solo lane. And Aquarius just takes the game over.
Did everything for his squad. Not only was he dominating in the lane, but had very quick rotations towards these team fights. This play in particular, I think, essentially saves the game for the Valkyries as well, just stealing objectives consistently, chasing out, separating the engagement. Aqua looks real good in this set, and especially on this tier. And I had thought, when Deathwalker was doing the tier stuff, or when SOT was first bringing the tier in as well, I thought maybe it's just a bit of, we're not used to seeing tier anymore. We don't know how to play against that god. The Lawbringer is just really good on the battleground and really disruptive, and we haven't had too many opportunities to see it. But now that Aqua is bringing it out in like the midsection of phase 3, I don't think we can use that excuse anymore. My man, we've got data on it. Every team in the league's played against it at some point. So they are used to playing against tier, and Aqua is still capable of doing that level of play against them. Very impressive.
Yeah, I'm wondering if we'll ever see I don't know, I guess we're in sort of a tier-esque meta right now. I don't know if tier will ever get to like full pick ban status before the end of the year, but in niche scenarios, it really worked fantastically for Aquarius in that set. And now that's now a win condition I think that the Valkyries have established. If they want to win through tier control, win through the solo lane, that's potentially something that they can look forward to as well. So the Valkyries, a fantastic weekend last weekend. They'll look to build on some of that moving forward. We'll talk about their chances at jumping up into the top 6, trying to avoid going straight to group stages. We'll talk about that towards the end of the show. But if you're going to reflect on last week, J-Mac, we've got to reflect on why viewers probably heard so many rumblings about the nature of a lot of the games last weekend. And it was all good stuff, right? And so to clarify, because of an interaction between Beads and Aegis, we have ruled that only one of the two can be purchased at a time, Beads or Aegis. Now, overwhelmingly, Beads were the choice. Yeah. I think every once in a while, maybe a jungler who's going Blink or something like that might pick up Aegis, but ended up being Beads the vast majority of the time. And that opened up the doors to different picks that we maybe were seeing anyway, but got a little bit of a boost. And it really felt like the picks with the big, damaging knockdown-style ultimates got a massive boost. And J-Mac, maybe Vulcan, that type of pick that was already seeing some play anyway, but because most, if not all, the carries were building Shell and not Aegis, Vulcan saw a bit more value this past weekend.
Yeah, kind of the problem with fighting up against a Vulcan specifically is whenever he gets to late game, whenever he's 4, 5, 6 items deep into the build, that ultimate's hitting for 1,000 plus.
That's ridiculous.
Shell is going to help you for about 250 of that, maybe 300 once you get to the late game. But by that point, he's already hit you with the Magma Bomb. He's already hit you with Backfire. You're probably standing within turret range at some point.
Yep.
And because of the amount of CC that is in there, if your beads are down and you get these Blink Guardios or you get these, these Blink Ymirs to the back line, your beads are now down, you're frozen in place, and right as you're about to get out of it, you're like, okay, cool, maybe I can just pop H. Oh, wait, I don't have the Aegis. Okay, well, let's hope that Shell gets through. The amount of damage that Vulcan's able to do early game, not as crazy. But once he gets even just a couple items online, especially since stacking items are so prevalent, being able to go either Warlocks or Book of Thoth, you get so much extra power within your first couple of items that you're already swinging for 300-400 on your magma bombs, on your backfires, your turrets hitting for 200 plus already in the early game. So by the time you even get to being able to use an Aegis for Earthshaker, you've already lost like 75% of your HP.
Yeah, I'm trying to think, because we saw plenty of base defenses. I mean, a lot of them in this highlight reel alone. I mean, I guess it makes sense. There are teams who are on the siege who are thinking, all right, once our carries get Aegis back up, we'll just walk in Earthshaker isn't going to suddenly save you the game. Even if I'm caught in it, I'm just going to Aegis. I'm going to keep wandering through the rest of the fight. So Vulcan, one of the risers in our current Beads Aegis scenario. But Myth, there are other types of picks that have seen that type of increase as well. A whole list of picks that we saw throughout the weekend last weekend. Another one of the mid lane style picks that hadn't seen much play, because Vulcan at least had been played a little bit. Poseidon maybe a bit more hit or miss, but also saw some play last weekend. Do you think Poseidon ends up falling into the same category as the Vulcan? That ultimate just sees more value when Aegis isn't on the majority of the players?
I mean, legitimately, everything we just said about Vulcan also applies to Poseidon. It's just a massive ultimate that does really, really good damage. So I think maybe better to discuss why those types of ultimates are a bit better now. And it might just be as simple as you can't just ignore them anymore. Aegis is no longer the, hey, we went in, we burned their cooldown, and now we can just start to take away a team fight. It is really, really shifted up the pace of some of these engagements. So often on Fire Giant Siege, when you're knocking on the door of the Titan, when you're on a Phoenix, it's, all right, first go ahead, we're going to go ahead and force out some relics. Maybe we get a couple ultimates. Once those Aegises are down, now we've got pick potential. We'll go in on the next rotation of abilities. But with Aegis gone, not only is it less offensive favored, we saw a lot of base defenses because they were able to fight back immediately with things like the Poseidon and the Vulcan. But it also really makes the offense have to think very hard about when they want to engage on these fights. Whereas in situations where you've already got Fire Giant, you likely won the team fight beforehand. So you'd already burnt away some defensive relics from whoever's defending, and you may have been able to maintain some of your own. I think it really just expedites the game. When you're only allowed to build one of these two defensive relics, it really does speed the engagement up. It's no longer the war of attrition, let me take a resource and go in. It's, we need to win this first fight, or we're going to lose this first fight. But either way, it's going to be entertaining. It's going to be a whole lot faster as well.
Do you put any stock, though, in the fact that we hadn't seen the Vulcans, we hadn't seen the Poseidons buying Aegis? They're somewhat immobile. I mean, Poseidon very, very speedy, depending on the type of build you go for. Vulcan can be as well. Any stock in the fact that they're also a bit susceptible as God picks themselves? I mean, I wondered if we would see a sort of balance where they're like, yeah, our ultimates do a lot better, but now us as picks, we can't just immune out assassins, things like that. Were you surprised to still see that rise in Poseidon and Vulcan despite them not having the defensive relic?
As far as I'm concerned, that is an interaction between assassins and mages that is expected gameplay dynamic.
It's gonna happen anyway.
We want the mages to be able to do massive damage, but if an assassin gets onto a mage, we want the assassin to be able to kill him. So I think it's just a really good interaction, and we saw it plenty of times. Mages get really far into that back line. They try and play super defensively. Panatom locks in some pretty crazy picks and just runs at him. Either he wins out on that dive or he loses, and it just creates these more heavy playmaking situations. A no Aegis world is a world where people are allowed to be heroes a little bit more often.
Myth, you are campaigning, and I'm on board for it. I'm sold.
It's fun to watch.
I'm not saying that Aegis needs to be removed permanently. I would never say that. My entire stance on the subject is that defensive options in Smite, as of right now, are a little bit too strong. If that means we need a Beads adjustment or an Aegis adjustment or Aegis maybe removed, maybe that's what it looks like.
Potentially.
But I'm not a designer.
Look, anyone who was playing against Panatom or in particular Susano this past weekend was praying that they had Aegis back. Now it is important to remember, specifically with Susano and Panatom, those two, the weekend prior when Beads and Aegis were both available, Panatom still had like a 10-0 something performance against the Valkyries. But one of the major risers out of the jungle this past weekend that looked amazing was the Susano pick, J-Mac. And the late game, you get a handful of items online. This type of play feels like we were seeing every single game.
Yeah, I mean, echoing a lot of what we said, Susano, very high damage. I mean, it used to be a joke, oh, God can't 100 to 0 you. He definitely can, and even when he's not building full damage out there, he just has so much damage and utility in the kit. But unlike the Vulcan, unlike the Poseidon, you kind of need both relics up against him. You want to be able to beads the pool or beads the Typhoon so you don't eat the knockup, but you also want to be able to Aegis the Typhoon damage so you don't eat 800-900 damage in a team fight. And it creates moments, and I kind of want to dial back almost to something that Betty Smite actually put a video out on it, I think just either yesterday or earlier today, which was the Bolts and the Scarabs game where Lasber did 5,000 damage in a matter of 2 seconds on Susano and didn't have full damage up at that time. Had, I think, a Magi's Blessing within his build and wasn't even done with his Heartseeker. This god does an absurd amount of damage. I would be shocked if we saw Susano make it through many of the picks and bans, especially in the hands of players like Lasbra or Panatom, even throw Scream in that mix. Yeah. I'd be surprised if we ever saw this god again this weekend. And if he does end up making it through, you better hope that your backliners are safe, have some kind of immunity to get away from him, because they're going to need it up against this god. He is absolutely absurd right now.
Yeah, any Betty Smite videos is probably going to be a good one, so I need to go check that one out. I think it's a worthwhile topic, though, Miff. Now we've gotten sort of, remember, this was decided early on in the weekend last weekend. Teams adapted on the fly. Later on, if you were playing in the weekend, you might be a bit better off because you got to see some of the games, theory, craft, work out the meta. Now we've had a full weekend of games and a full weekend, presumably, of scrims. Do you imagine the meta changes heavily from what we saw last weekend?
Well, I sat down with the Oni Warriors recently, and I was assured by 3/5 of them that the meta has wildly changed. Interesting picks, completely different looks at team compositions. But I've been lied to before, so I'm going to withhold that information until we get to see them play or see some of the teams that they had mentioned in scrims. But
who are the two?
They had brought up, I believe it was the Kings and the Leviathans.
No, I mean, you said 3/5 of the Warriors assured you. Who are the two that were holding out?
Yeah, Nika and Vote were like, stop talking. They were, stop talking about our picks. Like, I don't want to hear it.
Oh, they were going into the dynamic.
They were to get into the nitty gritty.
So what they were holding out on was their picks and ban strategy, not that they thought the meta wasn't going to change. Understood. Yeah, that's right. You were lied to by Benny Q, right?
As well.
Right.
Yeah.
He said
the Big Differ lied to me.
Unfortunate.
They beat the Kings last weekend, so whatever they lied about seemingly really worked out. Now, the Beads Aegis interaction created some interesting scenarios on the Battleground. Outside of the Battleground, we had some more roster news to talk about, and it officially takes effect here in this weekend. Another member of the Solar Scarabs has now moved to the Tartarus Titans. Head coach of the Solar Scarabs, Slaney, has left the Solar Scarabs, no longer the head coach of the Solar Scarabs, now the head coach of the Tartarus Titans. Benji, no longer head coach of the Tartarus Titans. And so the Solar Scarabs, A, looking for a coach, B, have to go up against the Titans this weekend. And just another example, J-Mac, of the Scarabs trickling over to that Tartarus Titans team.
Solar Titans.
The Solar Titans. It has just been brutal. I mean, if you look purely at the state of the two teams, it wasn't a fantastic end of the weekend for the Titans. Purely at the state of the two teams, though, maybe it's a move that makes some sense for Slaney as far as joining a squad. He's got some players that he's coached in the past, of course. And maybe feels like it's a better fit for him and maybe what they can get done down the road at Worlds.
I think it's a combination of that and also maybe kind of a lack of coaching there from Benji. It seems that he wasn't super active with the team in the last few weeks of play. So I think the Titans actually picking up someone who wants to be that active coach, somebody that they've worked with in the past, because now 3/5 of the active players on that team are former players under Slaney's tutelage at that point. So I think by having somebody that they're familiar with, and Aurora and Paul having to make their adjustments with it, I think they'll be just fine. They're going to play their own style. They've got their own unique way of going through. So I think for Slaney, it is a smart move because now he goes from only having coached one person consistently for a year and a half to now going with 3 people that he's coached either off and on for 6 months to a year or more in that case, with Stewart, Baronic, and then throwing SOT over there as well. So I think a lot more familiarity. I mean, also having Layers, who is a former member. I mean, there's so many players and pieces that kind of get picked up amongst this squad. I think it just makes sense for Slaney to stick with the players that he's familiar with at this point.
Yeah, look, and honestly, I think it couldn't have come at a worse time for the Solar Scarabs. This is a team that's trying to find out their identity, right? They're trying to figure out where their confidence lies, what their win conditions are, and having a head coach, someone to kind of rally the troops around and really sit down and spearhead things. You feel like that's only going to help. Of course, that's a perspective from the outside. Don't know what the team dynamic fully was on the inside. But now the Solar Scarabs, coachless, still trying to figure that out. I'm interested to see what they're gonna get done, change things up towards the end of phase number 3, and of course, that brings us to the world's picture, right? We've talked about this each week. We will talk about it each week because once you get towards the end of the year, the dynamic of the matches change, the importance of the matches all increase, they all change. And so we're at a point now where in our last 2 weekends of the SPL, top 2 teams, they get kind of a first round bye during those phase 3 playoffs. They just need to win 1 set to go to Worlds. Bottom 2 teams, they don't get to go to phase 3 playoffs at all. They move on to the group stages against some of the SOC, SEC squads, and then the 2 teams that don't qualify during the phase 3 playoffs. So there's, kind of this ever-changing puzzle, but top 2, bottom 2 are really what you want to look at, and then top 6 technically go to phase 3 playoffs and have a chance. And so, Miff, it's time for bottom 2 watch, week 6 or 7 or whatever we're in right now. Solar Scarabs reeling a bit. Does your opinion on the ability of the Valkyries to break into the top 6 change after what you saw last weekend, a win against the Kings, maybe some momentum building in that camp?
I don't think we can make a real qualitative statement on whether or not the Valkyries are surging right now until we see one more set from them. I need to see a little bit of consistency because the conversation of, hey, the Valkyries could just win randomly on any day, or in some set they might just be really good, has been a common conversation for the entirety of the year.
Just all year.
We are not strangers to Valkyries or Scarabs upsets. It's whether or not they can take that momentum, bring it into the next set. And so far, the Valkyries and the Scarabs have not been able to do that. So whether or not they're capable of it, I don't think there's a single person on the planet that says the Valkyries are incapable of winning any given set, especially now having seen them take out the Kings. Whether or not it's likely, I don't think so.
The issue is I was going to say, what do you need to see? Do you need to see a win or do you need to see a competitive set? But really, it has to be a win. Because if you're talking about math, right? Pure math and numbers.
Hate math.
There are a couple sets out of that top 6, and they've only got 4 or 5 sets left to play this phase. So you're A, relying on the Bolts to suddenly start losing and the Titans to suddenly start losing, and B, your team and the Valkyries starting to really increase their play. I think the same goes for the Scarabs. The Scarabs are in worse position because they're down 1 win to what the Valkyries have. So technically, mathematically, still possible for the Scarabs, for the Valkyries to leapfrog up into that top 6, but it's going to require win streaks from both of those teams, and it's going to require loss streaks from likely the Titans and the Bolts, who are just right on the other side of that top 6. J-Mac, I want to talk about the other side, though. If we're looking at, again, top 2 at phase 3 playoffs, win 1 set, you go to Worlds, and of course we'll have placement matches at the end, and the top team, that's really important. The top team from phase 3 playoffs gets to choose any of the 4 opponents coming in from the group stages to go up against at Worlds. So right now, Leviathans, Dragons, those 2 teams are going to be battling it out today. The Kings just on the outside looking in, though. Do you think the Camelot Kings have a shot? Are they on the outside looking in towards the end? Do you think last weekend, an 0-2 weekend, seals the deal? Clearly in the top 6, they'll go to phase 3 playoffs. But top 2, do you think it's out of reach now for the Camelot Kings?
I don't think it's entirely out of reach, but it's very difficult. I think it's in a very similar spot that the Valkyries and the Scarabs are in now, where the Valkyries and Scarabs need to have not only strong winning streaks from themselves, but also losing streaks from the Bolts and the Tartar Titans. I think the Camelot Kings and even the Oni Warriors are in that exact same spot to break top 2 for themselves. Is yes, they can win out, but they also need the Leviathans and the Dragons to lose out. Now, obviously, in our first match today, one of those is going to have to happen. One of those 2 teams is going to lose. But for them to lose 2 to 3 sets or more than what the Oni Warriors or the Kings can win out there is the important part, because it's not just them winning out. I think that they are very capable of making top 2. But the problem is they are now depending on other teams to lose. And that is the hardest thing to sit back and watch, is begging for another team to lose so you can grab a spot for yourself. It's always nice when you can earn that spot by beating everybody else at that point. But it doesn't feel as great when you have to sit there and watch and just hope and cross your fingers, go, man, I hope the Dragons have a really bad weekend on their triple header or double header where they lose both of them out. Because the likelihood of that happening with the Dragons' performance as it is now, the Leviathan's performance as it is now, very difficult to ask for both of those teams to lose 2 to 3 sets in a row, and then the Kings or the Warriors to win 2 to 3 more sets in a row.
Yeah, I'm wondering if best case scenario in this first set for the Kings is Leviathan's winning, just not even trying to get top seed, just seeing if you can knock off the Dragons. Leviathan's that one extra game in hand. So I wonder if the Leviathan's winning here, that keeps the Dragons a little bit more in reach for the Camelot Kings, may end up just being best case scenario. Kind of final thoughts here, gentlemen. Last minute or so of the show before we start off the SPL. Number 1 versus number 2 seed to start off our weekend. Miff, who do you got? Leviathans versus Dragons on Thursday morning. Afternoon. We're post-noon. We are well
hard to
post-noon.
say, right? If the if the Dragons look good in game 1, the Dragons tend to run with momentum. But I do want to echo your sentiment. Every team in the league right now kind of preying on the Dragons' downfall. Yep. It's okay if the Leviathans win. They've created some separation at the top. The Dragons rather, really the only ones that I think are foreseeable to fall out of that top 2.
J-Mac, Leviathans, Dragons?
Man, that is so hard to make an accurate prediction on those two. I'm just going to say that this is very likely a 3-game set, and all depends on, I think, who wins that first game. I think both these teams are very momentum heavy. I think if the Dragons take a game 1, this could very well be a 3-game set that they end up taking in game 3. If the Leviathans take game 1, it could just be a 2-0 in that regard, but I'm thinking we're hitting at least 3 on this first set.
We've got the number 1 versus the number 2 seed. We've got blood feud rematches. It is chaos carried over into this weekend of the SPL as well. We have got a lot of Smite to play this weekend, so I will delay no further. Make sure to stick around. Smite Pro League returns right after this.
Hey, wait, what did it win?
You win the respect.
You're telling me an alien wore this?
Perfect. Okay.
Okay, that was a good cut.
Messaging him to mute.
The best graphics you really need, Ultra, of course, and I can probably watch a stream on the side.
Content's gonna look good.
Pretty good, pretty good.